faithful participants for all three. Some have joined, this is your second time, and I'm sure for some of you it's your first, but I just want to say that I really appreciate the work that Stair has done to pull this all together. She's been a great partner. Network Nova has been a great partner. And I'm just glad for the opportunity, because this little side venture that I have on trying to change the narrative in rural America and about rural America has begun to get some traction, and this is a piece of it. So I'm really very grateful for those opportunities. As Stair said, this is the last of three parts. We started with the underlying causes. How did we get into this mess that we're in? Last time, we focused on the Democratic Party and the pretty profound shifts that have happened in everything from the culture of the party to its symbolism and language, and certainly its policy. And then tonight, we're going to focus on what we can do about it. And I'm excited to get to that point. I'm not going to go through all of these, but if you missed the first one, the kind of foundational session, Stair has shared, that's a tongue twister. Stair has shared a couple of times now links to the first and second session. So I'd suggest that you may want to go back to that, or if you've got something out of it, share those links with others so that we can all start at the same place with some understanding of these underlying causes. Last time, one of the questions came up in our discussion, and it wasn't why should we care, but it was kind of, this is tough stuff, and why do we have to be the ones to do all the work to reach out to folks and try to understand them and everything else? And I'm sorry, you're going to get a train in the background right now. That's Abingdon. And this quote at the very end of an amazing article by David Wong. The article was titled, "How Half of America Lost Its Effing Mind." It's in the guidebook. I highly recommend it. It's as insightful as it is amusing. But he says at the very end of this article, it feels good to dismiss people, to mock them, to write them off as deplorables. But you might as well take time to try to understand them, because I'm telling you, they'll still be around long after Trump is gone. And I think that's what we've got to recognize, is that while Trump is a kind of singular force for bad and dishonesty, many of the things that he tapped into were there before him, and they'll certainly be there after he's gone. So what I'm going to suggest is we think about moving forward, maybe frame our 30 minutes of discussion at the end in three categories. That if you've gotten something out of this and you want to do something with this, I'm encouraging you to think differently, to act differently, and to talk differently. Thinking differently starts with this recognition that a whole lot of people, not everybody, but a whole lot of people in rural Virginia and rural America, they believe that the economy has failed them, the government has failed them, and that the larger kind of dominant culture, which they perceive as a liberal culture, just completely disses them. That's the starting point. And I've touted this before, the Urban-Rural Divide Guidebook. I hope some of you have begun to read some of the articles. That article I quoted from of David Wong's is one of the articles in the guidebook. But I do think that this will help anybody who doesn't have a long history in rural America, and even some who do, with understanding things a little differently and thinking a little bit differently about how we got to this place and what we can do differently. So again, that's part of thinking differently. What I'm going to focus on tonight in the thinking differently segment of this is two things, basically. The Rural Progressive Platform, and then I'm going to come back to something I mentioned last time in Haney Lopez's race-class work. The Rural Progressive Platform, I know there's at least one person on this call, and there may be some others, Kathy Cole, who was part of a group of about a dozen of us from Southwest Virginia, who started not long after Trump's election in 2016 to gather and try to figure out what we could do about it. And what we decided to do many of us were working on a lot of different things at that point, but one thing we decided to do was to frame progressivism, the fundamental values of progressivism, in a rural context with a rural lens and a rural understanding. And this rural progressive platform, I think Stair has put a link to it in the chat box. It's a very readable document. It's 4 pages long. It's broken down a bit into sort of a narrative that talks about the pillars, and then it has policy recommendations. So it's really a very concise and useful document that I think, again, will help anybody who reads it to think a little bit differently. The Rural Progressive Platform says that this rural progressivism, which is akin to but distinctly different from the kind of mainstream urban progressivism, is based on these 3 pillars of land, livelihood, and community. And what I'm going to do here is just read to you just a little snippet of how we came to understand these 3 pillars as we developed the Rural Progressive Platform. There's much more than this in the platform, but this will give you a feel. We said that rural regions share a sense that nature is part of how we meet our needs, and we feed ourselves, create jobs and livelihoods, that the mountains, the forests, the valleys and streams are a practical part of our lives and economies. No doubt this is at least part of why we look at a chainsaw or a rifle so differently from most city folks. Yet it's also true that many urban communities have begun to revitalize and rebuild their own land base, whether as community gardens, farms, or public parks. The time is right for rural and urban folks to come together around the idea of working landscapes that respect the environment while helping people meet their needs. So you'll recall from a prior session where I talked about the irony that many people in rural America, particularly farmers and fishermen and loggers and others whose everyday lives are dependent on a healthy environment, really hate environmentalists and distrust the environmental movement. So this is part of the difference, is that because people in the countryside don't talk a lot about the environment, but they do talk about land and soil and forests, very particular. And so we suggested in considering policies, and we got into specific ones, that progressive policies must make partners of those who live from the land rather than just regulating and restricting what happens in the countryside. And truly, I believe if there was one thing we were going to do, that could go a long way towards helping to overcome the divide. In terms of livelihoods, we said that the sense of livelihood, of taking care of our own needs through sometimes dangerous work, and of being self-reliant is still strong in most rural people, still part of what we believe and what we want. People in rural communities are not as self-reliant by any means as we once were as a whole. Most people shop at the supermarket or online and other things. But whether you do get some of your livelihood from the land or not, there's still this affinity and this connection. So we went on to say that if we seem to resent people telling us how to manage our land, it's because we, the farmers, the fishermen, the loggers, even the energy workers, do a lot of the work that enables so many others to eat well, be warm, and live comfortably. And so we suggest that a rural progressivism and progressivism, broadly speaking, that working men and women have to form the foundation of this. And that isn't always the case anymore. It has been historically. And that our thinking and our policies should be built on responsibilities at least as much as rights, in the sense that we need to think about how our policies either enable or hinder people from helping themselves, building on a community's own strengths and assets. So that was part of our understanding of livelihoods. And in terms of community, we recognize that small towns and rural places, a lot like cities, have seen their community eroded by empty storefronts, consolidated schools, addiction, and more. And keep in mind that a lot of the empty storefronts are a result of a lot of forces, but bad policy is one of them, like the lack of enforcement of antitrust legislation, which has allowed for tremendous concentration of economic and political power in most sectors affecting our economy. So in rural places, that has profound impacts, and it's helped to denude many rural communities. Even so, we still tend to set down roots in our place. So when we're told to just move to where the jobs are, which is what the occasional liberal economist and pundit will suggest, we think it's a choice we shouldn't have to make, because we believe that a caring local community offers the best means to support and help our neighbors. So our framing for policies is that we believe that strengthening local communities should be a central goal of progressive policies. And that's strengthening local communities in a practical sense. Policy should help communities be more self-reliant, be more resilient in the face of crisis, be more self-sufficient and able to meet more of their own needs, whether it's food, fiber, energy, recreation, or anything else. Strengthening local communities has not always been a central goal of progressive policies, and we think it needs to be. So just to sum that up, if you read the platform, you'll see that we make the case that rural progressivism is not an oxymoron, that it's really, our version of it is built on the foundation of everything from Appalachian labor organizing in the coal fields to the prairie populism in the Midwest. And we think it's the right time to rekindle this in rural communities now, and that we can do that by helping to reconnect progressive politics to working people and these bread and butter issues. Now, the other change in thinking that I'm going to suggest would be helpful is Ian Haney Lopez and his book, Merge Left. His article, I'm going to quote from in a moment, which is in the guidebook, will give you a little taste of this. But as I said last time, he does two basic things through his research here, and this is a simplification. One is he really debunks the myth that the successful strategy is a middle-of-the-road centrism, that's how you win elections, that's how you win the hearts and minds of people who are not already committed Democrats, committed progressives or liberals. And he really shows over and over that that in fact is not the case, and that the large swath of the American public, roughly 60% of the people who are not committed Trumpers or right-wing Republicans, who are not committed Democrats or left-leaning people, are not so much moderates looking for tweaks to the system, but persuadables who hold both right and left-leaning views. And so what he did through his research that led to his book was he tested messages after gathering basic data from people about what they thought and what they felt. And he refers to it as an integrating race class, or a race class fusion in our policies and our communications. Here's an example. What he did was, with these thousands of folks across the country, he tested a number of different messages, and he tested some dog whistle messages as well. That's the messages that use coded language to blame people of color, immigrants, and others for the problems. And then they came back with a series of these race class messages, and they compared how the two were received. Here's the message, one of the messages they use. Certain politicians and their greedy lobbyists hurt everyone by handing kickbacks to the rich, defunding our schools, and threatening seniors with cuts to Medicare and Social Security. Then they turn around and point the finger for hard times at poor families, Black people, and new immigrants. When we reject their scapegoating and come together across racial differences, we can make this a nation we're proud to leave all of our kids, whether we're white, Black, or brown, from down the street or across the globe. And so you see, this is not a wishy-washy message. This is a message that has an analysis underneath of it, that the problem is politicians and their greedy lobbyists. He uses other messages where he talks basically about the 1% or the very, very wealthy. He names them, and he makes the case that while they're busy blaming people of color and immigrants, they're actually screwing all of us. And what they found in this extensive surveying and focus group testing was that 3 out of 5 folks in this persuadable group, that's 60%, preferred this to the dog whistle messages that they also had some receptivity to. Messages that sort of said there was immigrants were the basis of the problem and things like that. 3 out of 5 preferred this. They also found that it wasn't just white people in the middle that preferred this, but that African Americans and people of color more broadly also preferred this message, not only to the dog whistle messages, obviously, but to the kind of traditional liberal message that might be focused either on race or on class, but that by integrating race and class in a clear, direct way, they found that it had great power for both the persuadables and across color. So that's a very encouraging thing. And I think particularly in this moment we're in with the Black Lives Matter protests and the profound shift in the public conversation, this is a really, really good time to be perfecting these messages and really thinking through what they would mean in our own particular places. So that's the think differently part. Acting differently. I'm saying, I was just talking to somebody the other day about this, that the biggest challenge we have with rural people is rebuilding trust. And whether you believe that we should be trying to rebuild trust or earn people's trust again or not, the fact is we don't have it as liberals and as Democrats. So how do you do that? Well, beyond thinking differently, you got to act differently. And this image right here is of a fellow named John Mullins, who was one of the first tobacco farmers in Lee County, Virginia, to stop growing tobacco and start raising organic produce for the Appalachian Harvest Food Hub that I helped create with some other folks. And the interesting thing about here is that John is proudly holding 3 of the tomatoes. He had about 15 acres of organic produce in front of our packing house while smoking a cigarette. And what we did with John and many other folks in Lee and Scott County and across the border in Tennessee was we never dissed tobacco. We never talked about tobacco kills people. Tobacco is a harmful extractive crop on the environment. We never did that. Instead, we built a system where tobacco farmers had a viable option to shift to growing healthy foods and selling it on a pretty substantial scale to supermarkets and universities and other things. And this was an act that then has really, for me and some of the other people involved, really won the trust of people in the communities, because it came to them not judging what they were doing, but working with them to develop alternatives. That was kind of one example. I talked about this with folks in Henry County and Martinsville when we did a half-day session on overcoming the divide. And here's the thought here. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about what a pharmacy initiative is. They're emerging all over the country at this point. But the idea here is that consider from where you are that your local Democratic committee or Our Revolution chapter or your indivisible group or your own independent progressive organization might take on with other local groups a practical, impactful project that would have real meaning in the community, and take it on wearing your hat as a progressive or a liberal and as a Democrat, not wearing it on your sleeve and putting it in people's faces, but just don't be shy about your politics and your belief system in going about this. Pharmacy is an example. It's something where farmers work with healthcare providers so that doctors and other healthcare professionals write prescriptions that are redeemable for local produce. It's one of those win-wins where farmers like it because it's an additional market segment for them. Healthcare providers like it because their clients, who are people struggling with usually chronic disease related to eating habits and other issues, it helps to rechannel their habits towards healthy eating, fresh fruits and vegetables. So it's good for the local economy, good for farmers, and good for consumers, all in one fell swoop. And it's a great, great way to bring the community together for a really innovative project that can get attention. And imagine doing that in anywhere from Augusta County to Fairfax County, and then the kinds of relationships and trust that could build. those kinds of things are part of a larger approach, which we alluded to earlier, a working landscapes approach. Very often, at least the perception, but I think it's mostly accurate, the idea is that the environmental movement usually wants to shut things down. And rightly so in plenty of cases, for sure. I'm not going to say that there aren't things that shouldn't be shut down. But as a movement, rural people, especially working folks, tend to perceive the environmental movement as the thing that's always going to stop you from doing something, or it's going to monitor you and regulate you. But what if instead, at least part of that approach is a working landscape, whether it's around fisheries or forestry or farming or clean energy, where we actually develop legislation and policies and practices that provide incentives. So examples of that are these soil health bills that have passed in Maryland and California and Colorado and Washington State are the four that I'm aware of. They all now have laws that in different ways incentivize ranchers and farmers to do practices that pull carbon out of the atmosphere and put it in the soil where we're carbon deficient. And there's like a suite of practices, whether you're running cattle and sheep or whether you're raising vegetables or grains, that we know help to build healthier farms and soils, help improve the nutrients of the things that you raise, and also help with the climate change problem because it reduces carbon in the atmosphere. Now think about how that would be received by farmers and rural people as opposed to climate legislation that is strictly about shutting things down. Again, I know we need both, but this is an approach. Now, I don't know if Jonathan is on the call. He was brought to my attention as somebody that's kind of following this path around forest conservation and working forest lands. I'm going to pause for a moment. And Jonathan, if you're on the call, could you take about 1 minute to just explain what it is that you're doing there?
Hey, Anthony. Yeah, and I appreciate you guys having me on and inviting me to talk. But I work for the American Forest Foundation up in the DC office. I'm a program coordinator, so I work on kind of the grants and project administration side. But our work is all with family forest landowners. So that takes up the largest chunk, about 38% nationally of forest land is owned by just private landowners. So we try to connect them with locally based and trusted forestry professionals to do active management on their land. This is kind of a win-win, like Anthony, you mentioned, because working forest lands that are actively managed, and by that I mean a whole, like you said, a whole suite of different practices, are actually better for wildlife, better for carbon capture, than lands that are just sitting there not being managed. Oftentimes you can see oftentimes the rhetoric coming out of environmental movements is leave things be, preserve them as they are. And we look for solutions that allow landowners to meet their own financial needs while also taking care of the land for future generations.
That's perfect. Jonathan, will you put either a website or contact information in the chat box for folks who might want to follow up on that?
Yep, happy to.
That'd be great. And again, I think he's spot on. It's two things about it. I think the environmental movement generally has focused primarily on publicly held lands. And again, under Trump, they're under threat. So fair enough. But historically, the focus has been on the national forests, the national parks, and all of that, which are very important. But in truth, a large chunk, millions upon millions of acres, are small holdings that individuals have. And if those individuals only understand their options as a massive clear cut or leave it alone, and they don't know that there's possibilities of getting income from their forests, perhaps some timber, perhaps some non-timber forest products, while also actually improving the health of the forest and contributing to environmental sustainability, that's a really different scenario. So that working landscape approach, which has urban corollaries, I think just makes a ton of sense. And I want to wrap up in the next 5 minutes, so we have 30 minutes again for conversation with the last part. So I've discussed how to think a little differently, how to act a little differently, just a few examples. And I hope your wheels are turning about some local actions that you might consider taking on that could have local impact and build bridges at the same time. And now I want to talk about how we talk. So I've already pinged Hillary for this once, and I'm not trying to be a Hillary hater here, but I just want to give this as the example of what part of our problem is as liberals. When the Time Warner AT&T merger was proposed, she said that, quote, "I think it raises questions and concerns and they should be looked into." She talked about the need for Congress to hold hearings, and then said, "So I'm going to follow it closely, and obviously if I'm fortunate enough to be president, I will expect the government to conduct a very thorough analysis before making a decision." Trump said, "We will not approve this in my administration because it's too much concentration of power in the hands of too few." So that brings up the first of my 4 guiding principles for communicating in the countryside, for communicating with rural people. The first one is, don't talk so much. We just tend to talk too much. I'm terribly guilty of it myself. But if we instead think of listening more, creating space for other people to talk, and if we're talking all the time, there isn't that space. And also that whatever we need to say, let's try to get to the point. What Clinton did in those remarks was she used about 4 times the number of words that Trump used on the statement about the same issue. And at the end of that 4-fold greater verbiage, you really didn't know where she stood. And so that's a problem that we often have. The second one related to that is that I really encourage people to use real world examples when they're talking about big issues. It helps to explain your ideas. It helps to ground your ideas. If you, in fact, even if you start sometimes with a story or an example about something that is local to the community you're in, or just something that people can relate to, and then kind of move from that real world example up to a larger point that you want to make. I think that really helps with all of us. Most people prefer examples, but I think particularly in the countryside, familiar local examples are really essential. The third is to avoid jargon and talking points and our propensity for unnecessary complexity. It's like the old desktop little logo that said eschew obfuscation. That's kind of our thing. We use a lot of words, and oftentimes the words have become a sub-language all their own. And I go to gatherings of activists and liberals, and I'm really with people value-wise, but the language just blows me out of the water. I start to shut down. It's not only too many words, but it's way too much of this kind of inner language that's talking points and jargon. I like to say that when you're thinking about it, whatever it is you're talking about, talk like a neighbor rather than an activist. There is kind of an activist language, and there's nothing wrong with that in certain settings, but if we want to break through these divides, think about how you'd speak to somebody as a neighbor rather than as an activist trying to get their talking points heard. And the last part of the communicating principles, I'd say is, and again, this is true for everybody, but I found it to be especially true in the countryside, is that people relate to the concrete and the particular, not the abstract and the general. And how do you talk about the concrete and the particular and avoid abstraction and generality? Well, one is, again, by using action to speak for you. So going back to our prior point, if you are actually engaged in something in the community, you probably don't need to use a whole lot of words, and the words that you use will be grounded in that concrete action. I have a funny story that, back about 25 5 years ago, when I was first working in sustainable development in Southwest Virginia, we were building a little demonstration solar dry kiln on a private property of a fella in Scott County. And he was very gracious to allow us, give us a little bit of land because we were promoting sustainable forestry and we wanted to kiln dry the wood. We later went on to building bigger and better things, but this little demonstration kiln, we thought we would build it in about a weekend because that's what the plans said. Well, 4 or 5 weeks later, we're still hammering away and we're having a good day, making some progress. And I'm getting very excited thinking that we could just be on the verge of finally finishing this thing. And I turned to Glenn, the local landowner who was helping us out. And I said, Glenn, it's been a great day. We've really made a lot of progress. Do you think we can have it done by lunchtime? And he just paused and he looked at me and he said, if we eat late. And so Glenn, kind of in about 4 words, put me in my place of saying, first of all, just let's do it. Let's not talk about it. Let's do it. Kind of chill. And secondly, that he said that in just a minimum of words and conveyed so much. So I think that's the last thing. Let's stay with the concrete in particular. Let's be clear and straightforward because that is the kind of talk that builds trust. I know when I've either been campaigning or just doing community development work in Southwest Virginia and elsewhere, over and over again, people are grateful and people are trusting of you when you don't say too much, when you're concrete, and when you're straightforward. When you do the opposite, when you talk a lot, but don't exactly clearly say what it is you were thinking, then that's almost immediately a recipe for people shutting down or their red flags going up about whether or not they can trust you. So those 4 little communications principles I've found to be helpful, and hopefully some of this would have some value as well. I think when you get steeped in whether it's Democratic Party or liberal messaging, sometimes we lose track of these. They're all pretty basic. So that's it for me. We've got about 26 minutes minimum for conversation. Again, thanks to Stair and thanks to all of you for being part of this. As we go forward, I know Stair at some point in this next half hour is going to talk about follow-up steps at the Women's Summit. I'll suggest to you that if you want to stay connected to the work that I'm doing and maybe get back with me about working with your own local community on some of these issues, you can contact me at that email or go to my website and sign up for our little newsletter. But I really do hope that some of you will consider formulating a plan and doing some action locally that might begin to break down some of these barriers. But I'll stop there and share. I'm going to unshare my screen.
Well, Anthony, I actually thought it might be nice if you would put up those talking rules again. 1 and 2, you had
okay.
3 and 4. You had 3 and 4 up, but maybe put 1 and 2 up and leave that up a little bit, and people can make it smaller if they like. And just fielding some questions that were here. Francesca wanted to know, how can we get information about the soil health, carbon sequestration laws of Maryland, Colorado, and California?
Well, I'd say a couple of ways, Francesca. I'm not an expert on it, but I have been looking into it along with a couple of other folks who are part of the Virginia Green New Deal Coalition. Michael Riley, who's in the Shenandoah Valley, and Annette Osso, who's in Charlottesville, are among a small group of folks that have been working with me. And we've been working on rural and agricultural legislation as part of the Green New Deal. And one of those things has been soil health legislation, soil carbon sequestration. So we have a little bit of background now and can steer you. We'd also love to have more people involved with that working group. The other thing you can do is very simply Google soil health or soil carbon legislation in Maryland, Colorado, Washington State, and California, and you can read on your own. But I'd welcome people reaching out to me, and then I can steer you as well. Any other questions there?
I don't see any other questions here in the chat. Oh, I do see David. David, I'll unmute you. Oh. All right, David, I'm trying to unmute you.
There.
Okay.
Am I? Anthony, in terms of very concrete examples of sustainably making a living, tell us about Jason Rutledge and Chad Miano.
Sure. Well, Jason Rutledge is kind of a legend in the sustainable forestry horse logging field, and he's been doing it for I don't know, about 3 or 4 decades. And back when we were building our little solar kiln at the same time, Jason was leading a demonstration of sustainable forest management on around High Knob in Wise County, kind of bridging Wise and Scott County. One of the things Jason did, and still does, is to train people in sustainable forestry and horse logging. And one of those people was a young man at the time, really a boy at the time, Chad Miano, who's gone on to be one of the most amazing and successful horse loggers in the region. Back when Appalachian Sustainable Development had a sustainable forestry and a wood products business, Chad was one of a handful of loggers that that followed the environmental standards that we had. And so, yeah, that's a success story. And Chad has gone on to train other people as well. So it's kind of passed on from one generation to another.
Are there, let me look again in the chat. I don't see any hands raised. Okay, let me just see there. Do you have recommendations for small businesses that are not agriculturally based in towns and regions hard hit economically? Michelle Moore.
Sure, absolutely. There's, it's far beyond agriculture. There is a real surge. It still hasn't quite hit its stride, but in 2 businesses, energy efficiency and clean energy. So in Southwest Virginia, there's a group of folks in a network called the New Economy Network that have been working on a lot of different things, but one of the things they've been really pushing is for solar energy, solar installation, basically, whether it's on old strip sites or just downtown buildings or people's homes. And that's beginning to catch on. In fact, Terry Kilgore, who's one of the more conservative members of the Virginia House, a longtime delegate from Scott County, has become a not total, but quite honest to goodness supporter of solar energy. He sees the job and economic potential. So I think there's, depending on where you are, solar or wind in other places have real potential. There's another tremendous potential in energy efficiency, which is our cheapest and quickest way to reduce our carbon footprint, would be to focus on retrofitting existing buildings. There's a business that I often talk about in Southwest Virginia. A fellow named Joe Fortier has a business in Radford where he produces these super insulated building panels that can be used to build homes or community buildings or industrial buildings. And the panels that Joe makes cut the heating and cooling needs of any structure by 50% right off the bat. And his manufacturing center is run mostly on solar energy. So again, there's quite a few opportunities emerging around energy efficiency and clean energy. And the area that I would say is untapped, and I don't know enough about it to know why it's untapped, but is in waste reduction and waste recovery. In rural communities across Southwest Virginia, I think in many other places, recycling has come to a virtual standstill. It's ridiculous, but it's because, in part, we haven't worked to really develop the markets for products made from recycled materials, but also because we've outsourced all of that. We take all of our plastic and paper and everything but the aluminum, and we send it off basically to China for them to make something out of it. I'm ignorant enough to suggest here that surely there are business opportunities in sorting and making products from a range of different recycled materials, whether it's outdoor lumber made from plastics, whether it's mulching materials made from a combination of industrial hemp newly raised with old cardboard and paper. There must be some possibilities. I think I've come to say that we need to stop asking where are the jobs going to come from and start asking what is the work that needs to be done. And that question, when it comes to the waste stream, tells us that we have potential businesses in composting and waste reduction and new materials from recycled that I think are really tremendous. Lori and I just went down a couple of towns over and bought a load of compost from a guy, really high quality compost, who the major constituent in his compost is household kitchen scraps, which he mixes with leaves and wood chips. And he's collecting kitchen scraps from something like 180 households, plus a number of restaurants and coffee shops and all of that. We do that in our place on a small scale. But again, that's a small but successful business that's doing a really good thing. It's preventing material from going into the waste stream and turning it into a nutritious, nutrient-dense product. So I think there's a whole range of those opportunities, not to mention that once you start to get those businesses going, you also have a better shot at the amenity-oriented businesses. St. Paul, Virginia, where I used to live and where I've worked a lot, they have a highly successful brewery, but that brewery is highly successful in part because St. Paul has done other things to create downtown businesses and to bring people into their community. So I think there's a lot of possibilities there.
Thank you. So we also have some more questions now. So Nancy Morgan asked, what are the entry points to building trust on issues in rural areas? Issues, letters to the editor. So how do we get into rural areas and build trust? Well, if we're not there already,
Yeah.
I mean,
that makes me think that there's really kind of two ways to answer that. One is that there's plenty of us liberal progressive types in rural areas who have that challenge, even though we've been living in a rural area for decades. So I think when you live here, that does not by any means automatically mean that you have the trust of your neighbors. I would say that being neighborly and doing things that neighbors do, whether it's sharing garden excess or helping people out or loaning them your truck, all those kinds of things certainly can help. But I think that people, Democrats and progressives in rural communities have found plenty of hostility of late. And so I think there's challenges even when you're living here. Again, I think the number one thing we can do is take on some of these businesses and projects that really are good for the community, where people will begin to see you as something other than a Democrat or a liberal. If you're outside the community and you want to do good, I think the first thing is to work with other people if you're in a suburban or urban community. Probably the single most important thing, if you buy what I've been preaching the last 3 weeks, is to work to change the perspective of other Democrats and liberals in your community. It's just still too commonplace that smart, well-meaning liberal people in urban areas have really written off rural America. There's just a lot that people do in writing and words that kind of writes off rural America as either an economic basket case or politically hopeless or culturally backwards. So it would be such an enormously positive thing if scores of people started seeding these ideas, passing along the readings in the guidebook, and otherwise engaging in conversations that would begin to change that. Because if it changed there and people started getting a different vibe, and it would be harder for people in the country to write you all off as urban elites if the tone and the understanding and the language changes. So that's one thing you can do. In terms of a more active kind of engagement, I don't know how to go about this, but I know that NPR and some others have done stories where a group of urban liberals made connections to a group of rural conservatives, and they did an exchange. And it wasn't a one-shot thing, but it was an ongoing thing. And at least to hear NPR's telling of it, I think it was a group of folks from Boston connecting to a group of people in Kentucky. It seemed to be having a steadily growing impact on both sides, and certainly had gotten to the point where the mistrust had been all but eliminated. They hadn't come to harmony on their beliefs, but they were really beginning to overcome the mistrust. So Google that and look into it. There's no reason why a group of folks in Nova couldn't do something similar with people in Southside or Southwest Virginia or another place.
So let's stay with the farming here. Question about farmers in Southwest Virginia. I know the oyster industry in the Eastern Shore had to pivot to find new routes to market when restaurants closed. What has been the experience in Southwest Virginia? Are farmers there tied into a food distribution system that was shut down by pandemic? And should Virginia be doing more to make family farmers in Southwest Virginia more resilient in times like this? I bet yes.
Yeah, we could follow the principle number one, don't talk too much, and I'll just say yes. First of all, it's not just Southwest Virginia, it's all over the state. Farmers have struggled. Virginia declared farmers markets to be non-essential businesses. Some other states declared them as essential businesses like grocery stores. There was a big lobbying effort to try to get them declared as essential businesses, but it did not prevail. And my understanding is the governor did want to do that, but some leadership at Virginia Department of Agriculture were not ready to do it. So in the ensuing couple of months, people have done a lot like what Lori and I have been doing, which is using email or various online platforms to let folks know what you have and then to fill orders. There's some coordinated efforts at this where people are doing it as a group of producers, and then there's individual efforts. The online stuff has been really useful. It's also important for you to understand that it's about 2 or 3 times as much work for a farmer or a group of farmers to go through all of those steps to pre-pack orders and to then take them to a designated place or to people's homes than it is to sell them to larger buyers like restaurants and grocery stores or to sell at a farmer's market. So people have weathered it pretty well, but it's put a real stress on it. The food hub that I helped to start, Appalachian Harvest, where I showed you the picture of John Mullins, that has continued to get produce from local farmers and sell it to supermarkets and its other customers throughout. So food hubs, I think, are an important mechanism that help build that resiliency.
Okay, here's an interesting question for you. I like this one from Susan Harford. It is about if you were in the legislature, what would you legislate? And I'll try to find it. If you were in the General Assembly, what would be your top 3 to 5 legislative proposals that would appeal to rural Virginia?
Well, one of them we actually put forward in the Green New Deal legislation, pretty simple proposition that actually had bipartisan support, but got nixed at the 11th hour because of basically a squabble between Democratic leadership and the bill's chief patron. And we're hoping it comes back around this session. It's called the Local Foods Infrastructure Act. And it would have Virginia begin to support monetarily the development of local food infrastructure, which could help both urban, suburban consumers and farmers. Local food infrastructure could be everything from a community kitchen where people process food to a food hub where multiple farmers aggregate their product for sale to supermarkets, to farmers markets, or even sort of urban farming venues. So that's a really practical, straightforward piece of legislation I'd like to see. Another is a bill that has been brewing in my mind for some time. It's never made it actually to legislation, but I gave it the clever name of seismic, which I won't tell you what it all stands for, but it's legislation that would tackle the problem of corporate subsidization. In all cities, all localities, this is an issue, but in rural communities, it's especially the case that a tremendous amount of resources are spent wooing outside corporations with subsidy deals. The example I've used more times than I can mention is when the city of Bristol, Virginia, developed a $50 million package to get Cabela's to set up shop at Exit 5 on Interstate 81. And that went through, and Cabela's came, and in 4.5 years, it closed. They spent another $10 million getting Lowe's to close down and close its existing store at Exit 7 and move 2 miles down the road to build next to Cabela's. That's just sort of an extreme example of what's very commonplace, which is economic development is way too focused, not totally, but way too focused on recruiting big boxes and outside corporations. This bill that I have been assembling, sorry, that's my wife. This bill that I've assembled puts the focus instead, it gives localities state incentives to support existing local businesses and new local entrepreneurs. It gives additional incentives if those businesses, those local businesses, are ecologically sustainable, that kind of contribute to self-reliance and community resilience. And so the idea is you shift away from bringing outside corporations into the community as your main economic development strategy to actually providing state incentives to localities to focus on existing local businesses, on new entrepreneurs, and particularly on kind of green or socially responsible businesses. I think it's a practical bill, but it would turn economic development kind of upside down as it's now practiced. Is also something in the bill about supporting cooperatives, which is really critical. Worker-owned enterprises tend to do better in most respects than privately owned businesses in at least some economic sectors, and yet we have very, very few of them in Virginia or in the country. So that's another piece of legislation I would really be working for. There's obviously legislation around guns, around climate change and other things, but from a rural point of view, those would be two that I would really put emphasis on. And then the last one would be the soil health bill that we've already discussed.
Okay, so let's get to this. So Juanita, I think it was Juanita Joe, was interested in who was the sponsor and what was the sticking point, and I guess she's referring to that bill that got tangled up at the last minute.
Well, I don't know how.
Local Foods Infrastructure Act.
Yeah. I know that. I'm a little apprehensive about saying too much about this, but I think he's already said it publicly. So I guess it's okay. It was Sam Razul from Roanoke who was the sponsor.
Right.
It flew through the House, the democratically controlled House, and it flew through the Republican-controlled Senate, and it ended up with a little bit of reworking, but nothing about the bill significantly changed. It was pretty much what we wanted. And then what happened was that Delegate Razul also sponsored or supported the redistricting bill that eventually became law that we'll all get to vote on this November, about creating an independent, community-based and legislative-based commission to do our redistricting. the Democratic leadership decided that they didn't want that for a variety of reasons, some kind of legit and some not, in my opinion, but they didn't want it. And Sam stuck to his guns on believing that that was a good bill. And it was, as I understand it, just payback for his support of a bill they wanted him to pull his support from.
Okay, thank you for that. Let's see. On Bristol, when I interviewed a local official there about those economic development efforts and Cabela's, he said, we have very honest people in government. We have an extreme shortage of common sense, but don't quote him. So that's Michael Shea. Thank you, Michael. You can speak up if you like. I'm looking to see if why did you lose to Morgan Griffin? You are too great.
Oh, that's a long story. I mean, it's partly these issues. I think that the people that I met at my 100 town halls, the people that I interacted with, some of the workers that I took their side, whether they were coal miners or they were the people at a business in Bristol that got shut down with no notice. I think I won all those folks over, but the fact of the matter is that the vast majority of the people who went to the voting booth did not know who I was. And the D behind my name was, even if they'd maybe heard that I was a good guy or a working guy or whatever, the level of mistrust, I think, was just far too great to overcome. So I think that's the biggest issue. That's why I'm not running again. I think overcoming that mistrust through the various things I've been talking about the last 3 weeks is a longer term process that's essential to win back rural communities. I think it's great that to try to get candidates in every district, whether for state house or federal, but honestly, I think our time in some cases would be better spent working on a sort of 5 or 10 year plan to redefine what it means to be a Democrat, a progressive, a liberal, and to overcome this mistrust through the various mechanisms we talked about. And then I think we can start winning elections in these parts, but I don't think we can before then. The other factor was we had really crappy turnout on the Democratic side compared to my run against Griffith 6 years earlier. The Democratic vote fell, the total, twice as much as the Republican vote fell between 2012 and 2018. So that didn't help either. But I think the bigger factor was the mistrust.
I didn't want to put Juanita Jo on the spot, but I wondered if Juanita Jo wanted to ask a question. Let's see, I have to find you here. So are you still there, Juanita Jo? And then someone says, why not run as an independent? Okay, great. So Juanita Jo, go ahead and just unmute yourself and turn your video on, please, so I can find you. And just go start talking. So I'll introduce Juanita Jo a moment. She ran for House of Delegates in Louisa County area and has been working with us in some of our additional outreach efforts, which I'll speak a little bit about when I round up for the summit news. Juanita, are you on? Oh, no video, she says. Okay, here we go. No video for her. Okay.
I've got my my campaign photo up so that I don't have to do my hair every time I come on a Zoom meeting. So we're doing a lot in Louisa County to try to reach out to rural folks, and I want to really thank Jonathan for the ideas and Anthony. But Jonathan, referring back to one of the things Anthony said this time and one of the previous times about specifics in terms of ways that the soil health and carbon sequestration can be a benefit to farmers. What is a specific practice that I could talk to with a farmer to say, look, this environmental movement, this working to prevent even more problems with climate change, here's a way that it can be activated in your life that won't disadvantage you. So give me something specific to hang on to in a conversation.
Well, I'll jump in while Jonathan's formulating an answer as well. So if you have a cattle operation or you do livestock at all, a specific practice is known as mob grazing or management intensive rotational grazing. That is the practice of keeping the animals in small paddocks that are easily assembled with electrical wire and moving them frequently. And this is a time-tested pattern. Some of you know who Joel Salatin is. He's one of the great advocates of it in Virginia. But it's been proven to dramatically improve the health of the grass and therefore of the cattle, and of it builds the topsoil and pulls carbon out of the atmosphere. So rotational grazing, you can call it that. You can call it mob grazing because of the density of the animals. It's not difficult to do once farmers get the hang of it, but it does have some upfront costs in terms of fencing. And water systems is the other issue, that it requires more extensive water systems for the animals. If the person is a grain producer, corn, wheat, soybeans, or a vegetable producer, one of the simplest practices that some farmers already do, but would be supported, is the use of cover crops. And that could be cover crops while the crop is growing, interplanted, or it can be cover crops in between crops or during the winter time. Cover crops also protect the soil. They pull carbon out of the atmosphere. They build the soil fertility. They make it less vulnerable to drought. So those are two of many, Juanita, that could be absolutely understandable for farmers and viable. And what we're talking about is using legislation so that those kinds of practices are rewarded, so that farmers don't have to pay all the upfront costs, or they get a certain payment per acre for implementing the practices.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I can give one forestry example if you're not all spent out on these yet, but I would say that a classic pitfall you see a lot of landowners who have not been actively harvesting timber on their property do is they'll just sell the best trees in their woods to the highest bidder. And that's a practice called high grading, where timber companies will just come through and just cut out just the very best, like most valuable trees in the woods. And while you'll get a good return on it financially in the short run, it's really hard to reestablish those really big and healthy trees. There's a reason they're performing the best in your forest stands, because they've got the best genes and they are in the best spots. And it's much harder to establish the kind of trees that are going to grow to health and maturity than it is to allow those trees to naturally regenerate the stand around them. And so by working with a professional forester, either from the state, from a forestry association, somebody who's going to take a multi-pronged approach of both ecosystem services and income, is going to be able to maximize the benefits you can have on your land and in your pockets. And I don't know if Virginia does, and I should, but a lot of states will give you tax incentives for having a management plan written for your property by a forestry professional. So that's one thing you could encourage people with woodlands to do.
David brought up Jason Rutledge earlier. Jason used to refer to his approach to timber harvest as worst first, that he made it a point to not high grade, sort of the opposite of that. And I'll say that when we were running our sustainable woods business, although we did harvest, oak and cherry and walnut some, the bigger emphasis was on things like hickory, which had become more numerous And in fact, not just hickory, but some of the knottier and uglier hickory, which turn out make beautiful, beautiful hardwood flooring. If you ever set foot in the public library in Bristol, Virginia, that flooring came through our sustainable woods business, and it was an example of this opposite of high grading.
So I don't want to monopolize the conversation, but I've just had somebody look at some of my timber, and the person I had look at my timber was a sawmiller. So what it sounds like you're saying is include a forester in that discussion.
Yeah,
Yes.
I don't mean to vilify the timber industry. Kind of like Anthony, you've been saying, is we should avoid statements of contempt. I don't mean that everybody from the industry is out to pillage. There are some really good folks who are industry foresters, but yeah, consulting with a forester from the state or from an organization you trust is always a good idea.
Thank you.
Okay, so there was one question that I thought I would like to answer, seem polite to answer it, and that is, do the rural people really want us there? So that's,
I'm not sure exactly what that
it's like,
question is
yeah,
asking.
so the question is like, do the rural people care about these ideas? And if they don't, why are we interfering?
Well, I think that's maybe, I would see that quite differently. So what I'm not suggesting is that city folks en masse come out to the countryside, or that you think that the main thing you need to do is kind of adopt a rural community and work with them. I mean, if you're traveling for work or vacation and you come through Whitful or Coburn or Martinsville, by all means stop and spend your money on local businesses. That goes without saying. But in terms of the politics of it, it's not so much that we're looking for you all to come down here or come out here as it is, and country people would say this, the sense is that the rural economy has been screwed by really bad public policy that has ceded most of its power to a small group of corporations in food and farming and seeds and banking and entertainment. And that the larger kind of analysis of what went wrong in the country blames country people for being backwards, for being left behind, for not catching up with the innovative urban hubs. And so what people are looking for in the country is not so much a migration of city people as respect. And the respect comes in the form of what you say, what you write about people out here. It comes in respect to the sort of politicians that you elect from your own districts, and whether or not they have an understanding of the countryside. And if not, can you help them get a better understanding so that they don't write off rural areas or think that rural areas are hopelessly red? So I think it's more about I'm asking on kind of on behalf for a shift in how you think and how you talk. And then if it's appropriate in some ex-urban communities close by to you to form a partnership with other local folks to do one of these projects, whether it's the pharmacy or helping your farmer's market or a forestry related or whatever, that's great. But the main thing is in the policies and the language, and shifting that so that people in rural Virginia, rural America feel respected rather than dissed, feel understood rather than completely alien.
So let's go with pretty much one last comment, which is seems that affordable health care is a really good entry point for an issue.
Yes and no.
Yes and no. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it is in its practical manifestation, but the problem with Medicare for All is not the details of Medicare for All. And I was a consistent, fervent supporter of it throughout my campaign. The problem right now is the hurdle we have to get over is too many people simply distrust anything coming from the government. And until we overcome that, people will fight Medicare for All. Jonathan Metzl, I think his name is, who wrote Dying of Whiteness, a book that was recommended to me by a doctor in Martinsville. He documents how very sick white men in Tennessee that he comes to know and talks with fight Medicare for All, even as they're completely unable to secure the medical services they need because of the current system. And they understand what it would do, but because it's a government program, they want no part of it. And so I think we can talk about rural clinics and boosting them. I think we can talk about tremendous improvements in broadband so we can be better connected and do the telemedicine piece and better information. I think we can talk about expanding Medicare bit by bit, but we have to be careful when we talk about universal health care because of the anti-government sentiment. It may be what needs to be said, but I don't know that it's necessarily a good opening issue for that reason.
Thank you. And so what about the hospitals? I mean, a lot of hospitals have closed, and that's what we hear in rural areas.
Right, it's true. No, it's very
and
true.
So what and what can how can we help, or what needs to be done?
Well, the Medicaid expansion, had it come 4 years earlier, probably would have saved the hospital in Lee County and the hospital in Patrick County. So the studies show that states that took the Medicaid expansion out of the ACA had I think it was 1/6 the closing rate of their rural hospitals of the states that did not take the Medicaid expansion. So certainly that's been a good step, and certainly in other conversations, talking about how rural hospitals and rural clinics are a top priority, and that the expansion of Medicaid is really important to preserving rural hospitals is a good thing to discuss, because people do get that. Sarah, I wonder if you might, before we wrap up, just briefly, I've sort of done my plea for people to change how they think, how they act, and how they talk, and I've invited them to connect with me on a variety of things. You want to say a little something before we close about?
Yes, I should. Thank you. Nova? Yes, thank you. Thank you. So, thank you so much, Anthony, for all of this wisdom that you have given us. I mean, this has been really, really helpful. I think that we do need to slow down and figure it out a little bit, and and just don't go barging in talking fast. So so what we're going to do, right? I mean, that's kind of and confusing. Don't be too smarty pants. So so at the Women's Summit, we're going to be having 11 days of sessions. Okay, they're all up on our website, networknova.org. It's $25 for a ticket. You get into all of the sessions. And the one that we're doing about is called Raising Rural Voices, and it's going to have Delegate Chris Hurst and Wendy Goditis and Lee V. Fry of DPVA, and Sister Simone of Network Lobby, and other grassroots activists, and it's going to be moderated by Lindsay Stover. So Lindsay Stover has been meeting with a large group of rural Dems, rural candidates, and they will be highlighting also some of these rural candidates that I didn't mention here, and talking about, what needs to be done so that we can run someone in every district. So, so I hope you'll come and bring the conversation there as well, so we can, you know, continue to work together. So with that, I think I'll say good night, and thank you so much, Anthony. And I will send everybody all 3 links for all 3 videos. I'll get this one up pretty quickly. And good night. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.